Bleach and cheap lavender soap couldn't scrub away the memory of his hands. 5 years. That's how long Nora had kept her head down, scrubbing baseboards in the very house of the man who ruined her, hiding 2 little heartbeats in the city's dirtiest corners. She thought she was safe in the shadows of the Rossi estate. Until tonight. Tonight, a spilled glass of whiskey would force her to look Arthur Rossi in the eye and drop a bomb that would shatter his empire. Dust motes danced in the heavy, cigar-choked air of the study. Nora focused on them. If she looked at the floating gray specks, she didn't have to look at the bloodstains sinking into the Persian rug. Bleach burned her cuticles. She scrubbed harder, the stiff bristles of the brush tearing at the wool fibers. Her knees ached against the hardwood floor. It was 3 a.m. The house was supposed to be dead, silent. Footsteps, heavy and uneven, echoed in the hall. Nora's shoulders pulled tight toward her ears. She kept her head down, letting her greasy blonde hair fall like a curtain over her face. Arthur Rossi didn't knock. He shoved the oak door open with a force that rattled the frosted glass panes. He smelled of rain, expensive bourbon, and copper. He threw his tailored suit jacket over a leather chair, ignoring the maid kneeling on the floor. To men like Arthur, maids were furniture, invisible, convenient. Nora held her breath. She dragged her sponge across the edge of the stain. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. 5 years she had worked in this sprawling, cold mansion. 5 years of staying in the basement wing, taking the night shifts, hiding behind laundry carts. She needed the money. The medical bills for Ben's asthma and Lily's braces didn't care about her pride. They certainly didn't care that her employer was the man who had torn her life apart in a nameless hotel room half a decade ago. He hadn't asked her name then. He wouldn't know it now. Arthur walked to his desk and poured a drink. Ice clinked sharply against crystal. His knuckles were bruised, the skin split over the bone. He slumped into his chair and dragged a heavy hand over his face. The man looked exhausted. Deep purple bags hung under his eyes, and the harsh desk lamp illuminated the gray creeping into his dark hair. A cynical part of Nora rejoiced. Good. Let the world weigh him down. Let his sins crack his spine. Leave the rug. His voice was gravel, rough and commanding. It scraped against her nerves. Nora froze, her hand hovering over the bucket of cloudy pink water. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she met his eyes, the carefully constructed dam inside her would break. I said, leave it. Arthur sighed, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. It's ruined anyway. Just get out. She should have nodded, gathered her bucket, and walked away. That was the rule of survival here. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes to the floorboards. But her hands were shaking. A sudden, violent tremor started in her wrists and shot up her arms. She reached for the heavy tin bucket, but her slick fingers slipped. The bucket tipped. Pink, bleach-heavy water flooded across the pristine floorboards, soaking into the edges of scattered documents Arthur had dropped near the desk. Stupid! The word hissed in her mind. Arthur was on his feet in a second. What the hell is wrong with you? Nora scrambled backward, her wet hands slipping on the wood. She grabbed her rag, desperately dabbing at the soaked papers. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, sir. I'll fix it. Her voice betrayed her. It wasn't the flat, submissive tone of a servant. It was ragged, breathless with a panic that had nothing to do with spilled water. Arthur stepped around the desk. His polished wingtip stopped inches from her torn sneakers. He didn't yell. He didn't strike her. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tight, suffocating. He crouched down, the joints in his knees popping. He was close enough now that she could smell the peppermint on his breath, masking the alcohol. "Look at me." Nora squeezed her eyes shut. She focused on the cold dampness seeping through her cheap cotton uniform pants. She focused on the ache in her lower back. Anything but him. "I told you to look at me." His tone dropped an octave, losing the irritation and gaining something much more dangerous. Curiosity. He reached out. His fingers, calloused and smelling of gunpowder, gripped her chin. He didn't wrench her head up, but the pressure was absolute. Nora opened her eyes. Arthur's gaze was entirely black in the dim light. He stared at her face, his brow furrowing. He took in the hollows of her cheeks, the dark circles mirroring his own, the pale, trembling line of her lips, a muscle feathered in his jaw. He was searching for something, flipping through a mental catalog of faces, enemies, debts. "Do I know you?" he asked quietly. Nora swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "No, sir. I'm just the night cleaner." He didn't let go of her chin. His thumb brushed against the skin of her jawline. It was a terrifyingly gentle movement from a man who broke fingers for a living. "You're lying. Your pulse is beating so fast I can feel it through your jaw. You look at me like I'm a ghost." "You scare me," Nora rasped, aiming for a half-truth. It was safer. Arthur let out a short, humorless breath. He finally dropped his hand and stood up, towering over her again. "Clean this up. Then go to the kitchen. Tell Marco to give you your final paycheck. You're done here." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. Getting fired meant eviction. Eviction meant the kid sleeping in the car again. "No, please. Mr. Rossi, I need this job. It was an accident. I won't ever cross your path again." Arthur turned his back, staring out the rain-streaked window. "I don't keep people around who look at me like they want to carve my heart out with a spoon. Take the money and go." Nora stayed on her knees. The water soaked into her clothes, chilling her to the bone. 5 years of biting her tongue. 5 years of hiding in plain sight. Her exhaustion suddenly morphed into a blinding white-hot rage. He got to ruin her life and then casually fire her over a spilled bucket. She stood up. Her knees cracked. She dropped the wet rag onto his expensive mahogany desk with a wet slap. Arthur turned, his eyes narrowing at the sound. He opened his mouth, likely to summon his guards. "You don't get to do this," Nora said, her voice shaking, but loud, resonant. "You don't get to just dismiss me. Not again." Silence crashed back into the room, heavier than before. Arthur's hand dropped from the glass of bourbon he had just poured. He stared at her, genuinely thrown off balance. A maid raising her voice in this house was akin to a sheep barking at a wolf. It simply didn't happen. The men outside the door would have her in the trunk of a car before she could blink if he gave the word. But he didn't give the word. He stepped closer, the leather soles of his shoes silent on the wet floor. "Not again," Arthur repeated slowly, tasting the words. He tilted his head, his dark eyes stripping away the stained uniform, the messy hair. He was looking at her bone structure now. 5 years ago, the Belvedere Hotel, room 402. Nora's breath hitched. He remembered. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She had convinced herself she was a blur to him, a faceless body in a dark room during a week when he was dodging a rival syndicate's bullets. "You were bleeding," Nora whispered, the memory clawing its way up her throat. The metallic tang of that night flooded her senses. "You broke into the housekeeping closet. You had a gun." Arthur closed the distance between them. He didn't look heroic or romantic. He looked like a cornered animal, recognizing a ghost. I told you to stay quiet. I told you if you helped me, I'd pay you. You left blood all over my uniform. Then you left me there, Nora spat out, the words burning her tongue. The police found me. They asked questions. I lost my job at the hotel. I lost my apartment because they thought I was connected to the mob hit downstairs. I left a stack of cash on the cart, Arthur shot back, his brow furrowing in irritation. He hated loose ends. He hated feeling like he owed a debt. More than enough to cover a damn apartment. The cops confiscated it as evidence, you idiot. Nora's voice cracked. She didn't care anymore. The fear was burning away, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. I had nothing. Nothing. And then I found out I was pregnant. The study seemed to lose its oxygen. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner suddenly sounded like hammer strikes. Arthur froze. The irritation vanished, replaced by a terrifying, blank stillness. His chest stopped moving. He stared at her mouth as if trying to decipher a foreign language. Pregnant, he echoed. The words sounded hollow, empty. Don't look at me like that, Nora sneered, wiping a tear from her cheek with a dirty, bleach-stained sleeve. She hated that she was crying. She hated the weakness. I didn't come looking for you. I didn't want anything from you. I just needed to feed them. Working here paid double what the other cleaning companies offered. Them! Arthur's voice was barely a whisper now. He took a step back, hitting the edge of his desk. The heavy oak groaned under his sudden weight. His hands gripped the edge of the wood, his knuckles turning stark white. Twins, Nora said, the word a weapon she was finally unsheathing. A boy and a girl. Ben and Lily. Arthur shook his head. A short, violent jerk. No, women try this all the time. Women I've actually slept with. Women who know my name. You think you can waltz in here, spill a bucket of dirty water, and claim you have my children? He was trying to build the wall back up. The cynical, untouchable Mafia boss. But his voice lacked the usual venom. It was shaky. Nora reached into the deep pocket of her apron. Her fingers brushed against a crumpled receipt, a spare key, and finally, the small laminated photograph she carried everywhere. She pulled it out and slammed it onto the desk, right next to the puddle of pink water. I don't want your money now. I don't want your name, Nora said, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate hiss. I just wanted to do my job. But if you're going to fire me, you're going to look at what you're throwing out on the street. Arthur stared at the back of the photograph for a long, agonizing moment. The silence was agonizing. Outside, thunder rumbled, a low vibration that rattled the window panes. He slowly reached out, his hand visibly trembling. He flipped the picture over. It was a cheap school photo. 2 4-year-olds sitting on a plastic log against a blue laser background. The girl had Nora's blonde hair, but her eyes, dark, brooding, intensely sharp, were a mirror image of the man staring at the photo. But it was the boy that dealt the final blow. The boy had Arthur's exact jawline, the same unruly dark hair, the same slight crook in his left eyebrow. They weren't just similar. They were a carbon copy. Arthur's breath left him in a sudden sharp gasp. He dropped the photo. It fluttered down, landing half in the puddle of bleach water. He didn't pick it up. He backed away from the desk, his hands coming up to grip his own hair. Those kids look exactly like you, Nora said quietly, the anger draining out of her, leaving her hollow and exhausted. You can deny it all you want. You can kill me right here and hide my body in the foundation. But they exist. and they have your blood in their veins." Arthur stumbled backward until his back hit the leather bookshelf. The ruthless boss of the city's largest crime syndicate looked utterly, devastatingly broken. He looked at Nora, his eyes wide. The hardened shell cracked wide open, exposing the terrified man underneath. "Where?" Arthur forced the word past his lips, his voice cracking. "Where are they?" Rain lashed against the tall study windows, a harsh drumbeat filling the void left by Nora's confession. Arthur was breathing like a man drowning. He pushed away from the leather bookshelf, moving with a jerky, uncoordinated clumsiness that belonged to a different man entirely. Not the untouchable boss of the Rossi family. Not the man who ordered hits over morning espresso. Just a terrified, cornered animal. He didn't look at the soaked rug. He stepped right through the puddle of pink bleach water, staining the cuffs of his $2,000 trousers. He snatched the damp photograph from the desk. His thumbs, rough and scarred, brushed over the glossy surface, wiping away the chemical residue. He stared at the two tiny faces again. His chest heaved. A strange, suffocating noise caught in his throat, halfway between a laugh and a dry heave. "Where are they?" he demanded again, the volume of his voice dropping, but the intensity doubling. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a man who never heard the word no. Nora took a step back, her damp sneakers squeaking against the hardwood. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She had wanted to hurt him. She had wanted him to look at the collateral damage of his violent, careless life. But now, seeing the raw possession igniting in his black eyes, she realized she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had just handed a starving wolf a map to a slaughterhouse. "They're safe," Nora lied, her voice trembling. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to shield herself from his sudden, overwhelming focus. "They're at my apartment, with a sitter. You don't need to." "Get your coat," Arthur interrupted, stepping around the desk. His posture had shifted. The shock was evaporating, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused kinetic energy. He was already shrugging into his discarded suit jacket, the expensive wool sliding over his broad shoulders. "No." Nora held her ground even as her knees knocked together. "It's 3 a.m. You are not waking them up. You are a stranger to them. A dangerous stranger." Arthur stopped. He turned slowly, and the look he gave her made her stomach drop. It was devoid of the confusion from 2 minutes ago. It was pure, distilled authority. "I am their father," he said, the words heavy and metallic, "and you are going to take me to them right now, or I will have Dante trace your payroll address and I will kick the door off its hinges myself. Your choice, Nora." He knew her name. The realization chilled her. He must have read it on the payroll slips Marco kept. Or maybe he just absorbed everything in his territory without trying. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. Fighting him here, in his house, with his armed men standing outside the heavy oak doors, was suicide. If he went alone, he would terrify the kids. He would terrify Mrs. Gable, the frail elderly neighbor who watched them for $20 a night. "Fine," Nora whispered, the fight draining out of her, leaving behind a bitter, exhausted resignation. "But you don't talk to them. You don't touch them. You just look, and then we figure out whatever this is." Arthur didn't agree. He just stalked toward the door, throwing it open. The hallway was dimly lit by crystal sconces, casting long, warped shadows across the marble floors. 2 men in dark suits snapped to attention, their hands instinctively dropping to their waistbands. "Bring the car around, the SUV." "Now," Arthur barked, striding past them without waiting for an answer. Nora followed, feeling entirely out of place in her soaked, bleach-smelling uniform. She hurried to keep up with his long strides. The house felt like a mausoleum, cold, massive, and entirely dead. They walked through the sprawling kitchen, stainless steel appliances gleaming like surgical tools under the fluorescent lights. Marco, the head of staff, was dozing in a chair by the industrial ovens. He jerked awake at the sound of their footsteps, his eyes widening in shock as he saw his boss marching toward the garage doors with the night cleaner trailing behind. "Mr. Rossi, Marco started, stumbling to his feet. "Go back to sleep, Marco," Arthur snapped, pushing through the heavy fire door leading to the underground garage. The garage smelled of high-octane fuel, expensive leather, and damp concrete. A black armored SUV was already idling, the exhaust pluming in the chilly air. Dante, a towering man with a thick neck and dead eyes, held the back door open. He didn't spare Nora a single glance. To him, she was just another piece of cargo. Arthur slid into the back seat. He looked at Nora, still hovering awkwardly by the bumper. "Get in." She climbed in, pressing herself against the far door, putting as much leather upholstery between them as possible. The door shut with the heavy, muted thud of a bank vault closing. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint green glow of the dashboard. It smelled of Arthur's cologne, cedarwood and ozone, mixing violently with the cheap chemical stench radiating from her clothes. "Give Dante the address," Arthur said, staring straight ahead at the partition glass. Nora rattled off the cross streets in the south end, the worst part of the district. Dante didn't react, just shifted the heavy vehicle into drive. As the SUV glided up the concrete ramp and out into the torrential rain, Nora pressed her forehead against the freezing glass of the window. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers. She had survived 5 years in the shadows. Now, the darkest shadow of the city was sitting inches away from her, breathing heavily, his mind turning over a truth that was going to upend all their lives. She rubbed her damp, calloused hands together, desperately wishing she had just let the rug stay stained. Neon light from a broken pawnshop sign bled through the rain-streaked window of the SUV, casting harsh pink slashes across Arthur's face. The vehicle idled on a street littered with overflowing trash cans and shattered glass. A siren wailed faintly in the distance, a common lullaby in this part of the city. Arthur stared out the window at the crumbling brick facade of the apartment complex. Iron fire escapes clung to the building like rusted rib cages. The front door was propped open with a cinder block. Someone had spray-painted a crude gang tag over the intercom panel. "Here?" Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet. He turned his head to look at her, his eyes stripping away the darkness of the car. "You brought my children here?" Nora's jaw clenched. The shame burned the back of her neck, hot and prickly, but she refused to let him see it. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "It's what I could afford on the salary your people paid me. You don't get to judge." She didn't wait for him to respond. She pushed her door open and stepped out into the freezing downpour. The rain instantly soaked her thin uniform, plastering her hair to her cheeks. She walked toward the entrance, not looking back to see if he was following. She knew he was. She could feel his presence, a heavy, oppressive weight pressing against her spine. Inside, the hallway smelled intensely of boiled cabbage, stale cigarettes, and something sickly sweet masking the scent of mold. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed and flickered, threatening to plunge them into total darkness at any second. Arthur walked right behind her. His expensive shoes crunched over grit and God knew what else on the linoleum floor. He was looking at the peeling wallpaper, the deep gouges in the plaster, the deadbolts secured on every door. His jaw was locked tight enough to crack teeth. They reached the 3rd floor. Nora stopped in front of apartment 3B. The door was chipped green wood, the peephole smeared with dirt. She pulled her spare key from her apron pocket. Her hands were shaking again, the metal scraping blindly against the lock plate before finally sliding in. "Mrs. Gable is half deaf, but keep your voice down," Nora whispered harshly over her shoulder. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. The apartment was tiny. A single room serving as a living area and kitchen, with a small door leading to a bathroom and another leading to the only bedroom. The air inside was stiflingly warm, thick with the smell of vapor rub and old tea. On the lumpy plaid sofa, an elderly woman snored softly under a crocheted blanket, the static of an old television illuminating her wrinkled face. Nora crept past the sofa, motioning for Arthur to stay quiet. He stepped into the cramped space. He looked impossibly large in the room, his broad shoulders practically brushing the doorframe. He looked around, taking in the chipped formica countertops, the stacks of unpaid bills on the small table, the single rattling radiator fighting a losing battle against the damp chill. Nora walked to the bedroom door and pushed it open an inch. The hinges didn't creak. She oiled them every week specifically for this. She slipped inside, and Arthur followed, bringing his scent of rain and cold power into the tiny room. A single nightlight shaped like a plastic rocket ship cast a dim blue glow over the room. In the center, pushed against the far wall, was a twin mattress on the floor. Arthur stopped breathing. There they were, tangled in faded Paw Patrol blankets. Lily lay on her back, one arm thrown over her head, her blonde hair fanned out across the pillow. Her breathing was deep and even. Next to her, curled into a tight ball, was Ben. His dark hair was a messy bird's nest. He let out a soft, whistling breath, the asthma acting up slightly from the damp weather. Arthur didn't move. For a long, agonizing minute, the Mafia boss was completely paralyzed. His hands, usually so steady holding a weapon or a glass of scotch, twitched at his sides. He took a slow, agonizingly cautious step forward, as if he expected the floorboards to turn to dust beneath his feet. Nora stood by the wall watching him. She hated him. She hated what he represented, the violence attached to his name. But watching him break down right in front of her, watching the terrifyingly impenetrable Arthur Rossi crumble at the sight of two sleeping 4-year-olds, made a strange, painful knot form in her throat. Arthur dropped to his knees at the edge of the mattress. The expensive wool of his trousers soaked up the dust from the cheap rug. He reached out, his hand hovering over Ben's cheek. He didn't touch the boy. He seemed terrified that his hands, stained with so much invisible blood, would somehow taint the child. He stared at the crook in Ben's left eyebrow. He stared at the stubborn set of Lily's jaw. "Dio mio," Arthur whispered, the Italian slipping out a raw, fractured prayer. A single heavy tear escaped his eye, tracing a clean path down his stubble-covered jaw. Nora wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her wet clothes. "You've seen them. Now we leave." Arthur slowly lowered his hand. He didn't stand up. He looked over his shoulder at Nora. The vulnerability was gone, snapping shut like a steel trap. The eyes that stared back at her were hard, cold, and utterly terrifying in their determination. "Pack their things," Arthur said softly. Nora froze. "What?" "Whatever fits in a bag. Leave the rest. I'll buy new." Arthur stood up, his massive frame blocking the blue light of the rocket ship. "They aren't staying in this rat trap another minute. You're all coming home with me." "You are out of your goddamn mind," Nora hissed, the words slicing through the heavy, vapor-rub-scented air of the bedroom. She didn't care that he was Arthur Rossi. She stepped directly into his path, pressing her hands against the damp wool of his suit jacket to physically shove him back from the mattress. It was like pushing against a brick wall. He didn't budge an inch, but his eyes snapped down to her trembling fingers. "Step aside, Nora." His voice was a flat, deadened rumble. It wasn't a threat. It was a simple statement of gravity. He expected the world to rearrange itself around him. No? Nora kept her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, terrifyingly calm thud of his heart beneath the expensive fabric. "You do not get to walk into this room, look at them for 30 seconds, and decide you own them. They are not one of your casinos. They are not a shipment on the docks." Arthur's jaw feathered. He looked past her shoulder, his gaze fixing on the rusted radiator pipe that was leaking a slow, steady drip of brown water onto the baseboards. Black mold spiderwebbed up the peeling wallpaper behind it. "You think this is a life?" Arthur's voice dropped, tightening with a furious, suffocating control. He gestured to the room, the single window that was painted shut and barred with cheap iron. "You have them sleeping on a mattress on the floor next to black mold. There are junkies shooting up in the stairwell. I saw 3 gang tags on the way up here. If a stray bullet comes through that drywall, your pride isn't going to stop it." The truth stung, a hot slap to her exhausted face. Nora swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her knees. She knew it was dangerous. She spent every night staring at the ceiling, listening to sirens, praying the heavy deadbolts would hold. But it was hers. She had kept them alive. "I kept them safe from your world," Nora spat back, her voice shaking. "You think a bullet through the drywall is bad? What about a car bomb in your driveway? What about the men who want to cut your throat, Arthur? You think they won't use 2 4-year-old kids to get to you?" Silence rushed back into the cramped room. Arthur stared at her. The darkness in his eyes shifted, churning with a sudden violent realization. She was right. The moment he claimed them, he painted targets on their tiny backs. But looking at the peeling paint, the damp cold seeping through his expensive leather shoes, he made the calculation. His world was violent, but it was fortified with millions of dollars of security, armored glass, and men with automatic rifles. This world was just a slaughterhouse waiting for the doors to open. "They're coming with me," Arthur repeated, the debate officially over. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. "Pack their things, whatever they need for tonight. I'll have a team clear the rest of this trash out tomorrow." "Don't call my life trash," Nora whispered, her throat burning. Before Arthur could respond, a wet rattling sound came from the mattress. Nora spun around. Ben was curling into a tighter ball, his small chest heaving. A harsh, whistling wheeze cut through the quiet room. The damp cold of the rain outside was seeping into the poorly insulated building, triggering his lungs. Panic, familiar and sharp, overrode her anger. Nora dropped to her knees beside the mattress, pulling a yellow plastic spacer and an albuterol inhaler from the milk crate she used as a nightstand. "Benny, hey, bug, sit up for me," she coaxed softly, slipping one arm under his narrow shoulders and propping him up. The boy's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He let out a frightening, barking cough that shook his tiny frame. Arthur froze completely. The intimidating Mafia boss vanished, leaving behind a man who suddenly didn't know what to do with his hands. He took a jerky step forward, then stopped, his polished shoes squeaking on the linoleum. He watched, helpless, as Nora expertly pressed the mask over the boy's nose and mouth. "Breathe deep, Bug. That's it. 1, 2, 3, she counted, her voice steady and practiced, hiding the sheer terror she felt every time his airway tightened. Lily stirred beside them. The little girl rubbed her eyes with small, balled-up fists. She blinked at the harsh blue light of the rocket ship lamp, then looked up. Her dark eyes, Arthur's eyes, locked onto the towering man in the tailored suit standing at the foot of their mattress. She didn't scream. She just stared at him with a blunt, unnerving curiosity. "Mama," Lily mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Who's the giant?" Arthur stopped breathing. He stared down at the little girl, his chest tight, a sudden blinding pressure building behind his eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? "I'm the man who broke your mother. I'm the man who rules the city's underworld." "He's my boss, Lily," Nora said, her voice tight. She pulled the inhaler mask away from Ben's face. The boy's breathing was evening out, the harsh whistle fading. "Why is he wet?" Lily asked, pointing a tiny finger at the rainwater soaking Arthur's shoulders. "Because we're leaving," Arthur finally spoke, his voice gravelly, lacking its usual sharp edge. He crouched down, his knees popping in the quiet room. He forced himself to look Lily in the eye, trying to soften the hard planes of his face. "Your mom is getting a promotion. You're going to come stay at my house." Nora shot him a venomous look, but she didn't contradict him. She laid Ben gently back onto the pillow. She had $50 in her checking account. The mold was making her son sick. She hated Arthur Rossi with every fiber of her being, but she loved her children more than she hated him. Defeated, she stood up and walked to the closet. She pulled out a black plastic trash bag. She didn't own a suitcase. Arthur stood up, his eyes locking onto the crinkling plastic bag. A look of sheer revulsion crossed his face. Without a word, he unlatched the expensive, handmade leather briefcase he had carried from the SUV, dumped a stack of manila folders, encrypted phones, and a spare magazine of hollow point bullets directly onto the dirty linoleum, and held the empty leather bag out to her. "Use this," he ordered quietly. Neon light from the pawn shop across the street washed over Dante's face as he stood in the doorway of the apartment building. The hulking bodyguard had his hand resting casually over his holstered weapon, his eyes scanning the empty, rain-slicked street. He turned as heavy footsteps echoed on the decaying stairwell. First came Arthur, carrying Ben. The boy was dead to the world again, his cheek pressed against the wet, expensive wool of Arthur's coat. Arthur held him awkwardly, his large hands splayed wide across the boy's back, terrified of crushing something fragile. He walked stiffly, as if navigating a minefield. Right behind him was Nora. She carried the heavy leather briefcase bulging with cheap toddler clothes, holding Lily's hand. The little girl was wide awake now, clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit, her dark eyes darting around the grim hallway. On their way out, Arthur had stopped at the sofa. Mrs. Gable snorted awake, terrified by the sudden appearance of the imposing man. Before she could scream, Arthur pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from his pocket, peeled off a stack thick enough to choke a horse, and dropped it onto her lap. "You saw nothing tonight. Go buy a new television," he had growled, leaving the old woman clutching the cash in stunned silence. Dante's dead eyes widened a fraction of an inch as his boss emerged into the rain carrying a sleeping child. "Open the door," Arthur snapped, the edge returning to his voice. Dante scrambled to pull the heavy armored door of the SUV open. Arthur ducked inside, maneuvering his tall frame onto the leather seats while carefully shifting Ben onto his lap. Nora climbed in next, pulling Lily onto her lap, placing the briefcase on the floorboards. The door slammed shut. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, insulated entirely from the chaotic city noise outside. "Turn the heat up," Arthur ordered the partition grill. "And drive smoothly, no hard turns." The SUV pulled away from the curb. Nora stared out the tinted window, watching her grim, broken neighborhood slide past. She felt physically ill. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, trembling exhaustion in its wake. She squeezed her arms around Lily, burying her nose in the little girl's messy blonde hair. It smelled of cheap strawberry shampoo. Lily wasn't looking out the window. She was staring at Arthur. The little girl reached out a small, pale hand and poked the sleeve of Arthur's soaked suit jacket. Arthur flinched as if she had branded him with a hot iron. He looked down at the tiny finger pressing into his arm. "You're making Ben wet," Lily stated matter-of-factly, her dark eyes glaring at him with a startling amount of authority. A choked, breathless sound escaped Arthur's throat. A laugh. It was a rusty, unused sound. He carefully shrugged out of his soaked outer coat, mindful of the sleeping boy on his lap, and tossed it onto the empty seat beside him. Ben grumbled at the movement, shifting closer to the warmth of Arthur's chest, his small hand inadvertently clutching the silk of Arthur's expensive tie. Arthur went completely rigid. He stared at the tiny hand holding his tie, his chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. He looked at Nora. The ruthless syndicate boss looked utterly panicked. "He's fine," Nora whispered bitterly, turning her head back to the window. "He's just cold." The drive to the Rossi estate took 30 minutes. 30 minutes of agonizing, suffocating tension. The gates of the massive compound swung open, the SUV gliding up the manicured driveway toward the sprawling limestone mansion. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the estate still looked like a fortress in the gloom. Dante parked under the massive portico. When Arthur stepped out, Ben finally stirred, blinking sleepily at the harsh security lights. The boy looked up, his face a mirror of the man holding him. "Where are we?" Ben rasped, rubbing his eyes. "Home," Arthur said, the words sounding heavy and absolute. Nora stepped out, clutching Lily's hand. She ignored Arthur's declaration. They walked through the massive double doors into the marble foyer. The crystal chandelier overhead threw harsh light onto their pathetic procession. Marco, the head of staff, came rushing down the grand staircase, still tying his robe. He froze on the bottom step. His mouth fell open. He looked at Arthur, holding the boy, then at Nora, still wearing her bleach-stained maid's uniform, holding the little girl. "Mr. Rossi, What is happening?" Marco stammered. "Have the East Wing guest suite prepared immediately," Arthur commanded, his voice echoing off the marble. "Fine clothes, blankets, whatever they need, and bring warm milk to the room." "Sir, it's 4 a.m. The East Wing is—" "Do it, Marco," Arthur snarled, the dangerous edge snapping back into his tone. Marco scrambled away without another word. 10 minutes later, Nora stood in the center of the East Wing's master bedroom. The space was bigger than her entire apartment. A massive king-size bed dominated the room, covered in silk sheets. The fireplace was already crackling, throwing warm light across the Persian rugs. Arthur had placed Ben onto the massive bed. Lily scrambled up beside her brother, her eyes wide at the sheer size of the room. They looked terrifyingly small against the pillows. Arthur stood by the door, his hands clasped behind his back. He was watching the kids, his dark eyes hungry, desperate, yet terrified to get too close. Nora walked over to the door. She didn't look like a maid anymore. Her uniform was ruined, her hair was a tangled mess, but her spine was steel. She stopped a foot away from him. "They're going to sleep now," Nora said softly, her voice barely carrying over the crackle of the fire. Arthur looked down at her. The vulnerability from the apartment was gone. He was back in his fortress. He was the king again. "They are my blood, Nora. They stay here. With me." "They stay with me," Nora corrected, her eyes blazing up at him. "You provided half the genetics in a dirty hotel room, Arthur. I provided the last 4 years of blood, sweat, and starvation. You don't get to just claim them because you have the money to buy them a nicer bed. You want to be in their lives? You earn it. From me." She reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle of the bedroom door and pulled it. Arthur didn't stop her. He held her gaze for a long, heavy second, recognizing a ruthlessness in her that mirrored his own. He stepped backward into the hallway. Nora shut the door in the Mafia boss's face, the heavy click of the lock echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Sunlight pierced the narrow gap in the heavy velvet drapes, striking Nora directly in the eye. She hadn't moved from the brocade armchair positioned squarely between the king-size bed and the heavy mahogany door. Her neck screamed in protest as she shifted. The cheap cotton of her uniform, stiff with dried bleach and sweat, rubbed raw against her collarbone. She felt disgusting. She felt entirely out of her depth. On the massive bed, the twins were already stirring. Lily sat up first, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. She stared at the vaulted ceiling, painted with faint frescoes of clouds, then looked down at the silk sheets pooled around her waist. She didn't look scared. She looked like a child who had woken up inside a television screen. "Mama," Lily whispered, her voice carrying easily in the cavernous space. "Are we in a hotel?" "Something like that, Bug," Nora said, her voice hoarse. She stood up, her knees popping loudly in the quiet room. Ben rolled over, coughing weakly into his elbow. The wheeze was gone, thanks to the dry, filtered air of the mansion, but the dark circles under his eyes remained. He clutched his faded Paw Patrol blanket, the only thing they had brought from the apartment, tightly against his chest. He looked at the heavy door, then back to his mother. He remembered the giant in the rain. A sharp, authoritative double knock rattled the door before Nora could speak. She tensed, her hand instinctively dropping to the heavy brass lamp on the side table. "Open it," a muffled voice commanded. "Arthur." Nora walked to the door, her bare feet sinking an inch into the plush Persian rug. She flipped the deadbolt and pulled the door open, just enough to block the threshold with her body. Arthur stood in the hallway. He looked worse than she did. He had stripped off the suit jacket and tie, wearing only a wrinkled white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Dark, bruised shadows hollowed out his eyes, and a rough layer of black stubble coated his jaw. He smelled strongly of black coffee and old cigarette smoke. He was holding 2 large, glossy paper bags from a high-end children's boutique downtown. The store didn't open until 10. It was barely 7 in the morning. He had clearly woken someone up and thrown cash at them. "Let me in," Arthur said. It wasn't a request, but the violent edge from last night was entirely gone, replaced by a brittle, exhausted tension. Nora didn't move. "They just woke up. You are not going to overwhelm them." "I brought clothes," Arthur countered, lifting the bag slightly. His eyes darted over her shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of the bed. "Marco is bringing breakfast to the dining room. They need to eat. You need to change out of that. Whatever that is." He looked at her stained uniform with undisguised distaste. Nora flushed hotly, her grip on the doorknob tightening until her knuckles turned white. "I'll dress them," Nora said coldly, snatching the bags from his hands. "We will be down in 20 minutes. Do not hover outside this door." She shut it in his face again. It was a petty victory, but in a house surrounded by armed guards and razor wire, she had to take the control she could get. Nora tore open the bags. Inside were thick cashmere sweaters, soft denim jeans, and brand-new sneakers that smelled of fresh rubber. There was a simple slate-gray linen dress at the bottom, clearly intended for her. She stared at it for a long time. Putting on his clothes felt like putting on a collar, but her uniform reeked of the floorboards she had scrubbed, a bitter reminder of her servitude. She stripped it off and pulled the dress over her head. It fit perfectly. That terrified her more than anything. 20 minutes later, Nora led the twins down the grand staircase. The house was unnervingly silent. The usual bustle of maids and guards was entirely absent. Arthur had cleared the floor. The dining room was vast, dominated by a table carved from a single slab of dark walnut. Arthur sat at the far head. The table was absolutely covered in food. Silver cloches hid steaming plates of bacon, eggs, and sausages, bowls of exotic fruits, stacked pancakes dripping with syrup, and 3 different pitchers of juice crowded the wood. It was a chaotic, desperate display of provision. Arthur stood up as they entered. His massive frame immediately dwarfed the room. Ben shrank behind Nora's leg, burying his face in the gray linen of her new dress. Lily, ever the brave one, marched forward and climbed onto a heavy chair, her eyes wide at the mountain of pancakes. "Sit," Arthur commanded, pointing to the chairs nearest him. Nora guided Ben to a chair sitting between him and Arthur. She didn't touch the food. She poured a glass of apple juice for Ben and pushed it toward him. Arthur watched them intensely. He picked up a silver serving knife and a pair of tongs, awkwardly reaching over to slice a piece of pancake for Ben. The knife scraped loudly against the china. Ben flinched violently at the sound, pressing his back hard against the chair. He looked at Arthur's large, scarred hands holding the knife, his breathing suddenly hitching in his chest. The boy was terrified. Arthur froze. The silver knife slipped from his grip, clattering loudly onto the table. He stared at his son, reading the abject fear in the boy's dark eyes. A muscle feathered violently in Arthur's jaw. The Mafia boss, a man who fed on the fear of his enemies, looked physically sickened by the terror in his own child's face. He slowly pulled his hands back, resting them flat on his lap beneath the table. "Nora," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, defeated whisper. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the grain of the walnut table. "Cut his food for him." Cigarette smoke hung in thick, acrid sheets near the ceiling of Arthur's private office. He crushed the butt of his 4th cigarette into a crystal ashtray, the glass already choked with gray ash. Across the desk sat Leo, his most ruthless capo. Leo wore a sharp charcoal suit, his nose broken and reset too many times to count, giving him a permanent, ugly sneer. "The men are asking questions, boss," Leo rumbled, swirling 2 fingers of scotch in his glass. "You locked down the East Wing. You sent Marco to buy out a toy store at 6 in the morning. And Dante says he picked up the night cleaner from the South End last night." Arthur didn't blink. He kept his hands flat on the leather desk blotter. His knuckles were white. "Dante talks too much." "Dante is loyal to the family," Leo countered, leaning forward, "which is why he's worried. If this maid saw something she shouldn't have, I can take care of it. You don't need to keep her locked up here. It's messy. Just give me the word." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arthur stood up. He didn't rush. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, walking around the desk until he stood directly over Leo. "If you," Arthur said, his voice a soft, lethal hiss, "or any of your men so much as look at the east wing, I will peel the skin from your face and nail it to the front gates. Am I understood?" Leo froze, the scotch stopping mid-swirl. He looked up, expecting to see the usual cold calculation in his boss's eyes. Instead, he saw absolute, unhinged madness. The kind of protective rage that burned down cities. "Understood, Arthur." Leo swallowed hard, setting the glass down. "No one goes near the wing." "Get out." Arthur turned his back, staring out the reinforced glass window overlooking the gardens. He waited until the heavy oak door clicked shut before letting out a shaky breath. Leo was right. It was messy. It was dangerous. The second the other families realized Arthur Rossi had blood walking around, the twins would become leverage. The thought made a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He left the office, bypassing his security detail with a sharp wave of his hand, and walked toward the east wing. The hallway felt different today. For 5 years, it had been a museum of quiet luxury. Now, it echoed with a strange, high-pitched noise. Arthur stopped outside the double doors. He listened. It was laughter. High, clear, and totally unrestrained. He pushed the door open an inch. The master suite was a disaster zone. The pristine Persian rugs were covered in a chaotic web of wooden train tracks. Ben was on his knees in the center of the room, pushing a brightly painted red locomotive across a wooden bridge. Lily was sitting on the edge of the mattress, barking orders about where the tracks should go. Nora sat on the floor near the fireplace, leaning back against the marble hearth. The tension in her shoulders had melted just a fraction. She was watching her kids, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. Arthur pushed the door open entirely. The laughter died instantly. Ben snatched his hand back from the wooden train, shrinking away. Lily went completely still. Nora's smile vanished, replaced by the hardened, defensive glare she reserved entirely for him. The silence was a physical weight. Arthur looked down at the wooden tracks scattered across his expensive floor. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He slowly took off his suit jacket, tossing it over a chair, and loosened his tie. He walked into the center of the room and sank down onto the floor, the joints in his knees cracking loudly. He sat cross-legged, a foot away from the wooden bridge Ben had built. No one moved. Arthur reached out, his massive, scarred hand hovering over a loose piece of curved wooden track. He picked it up. He looked at Ben. The boy's eyes were wide, tracking Arthur's every movement like he was a predator about to strike. Arthur didn't speak. He just slowly, clumsily, snapped the curved piece of wood into the end of the track. The wooden pegs clicked together. He picked up another piece. Click. "The bridge doesn't go to the station," Arthur murmured softly, not looking up, addressing the track instead of the boy. "The train is going to crash into the rug." Ben hesitated. He looked at Nora. She gave a microscopic, tight nod. Ben crawled forward, moving an inch at a time. He reached out and grabbed a straight piece of track. He placed it next to Arthur's hand, connecting it to the curve. "It goes to the mountain," Ben whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He pointed to a pile of thick throw pillows Arthur had paid $500 apiece for. Arthur looked at the pillows. He nodded slowly, his face deadly serious. The mountain. Right. Nora watched them from the hearth. The contradiction of it made her chest ache. Here was a man who commanded an army of killers, a man who broke bones with his bare hands, sitting on the floor in a wrinkled shirt, carefully building a wooden railway to a mountain of pillows. His hands were too big, fumbling with the tiny wooden pegs, but he was trying with a desperate, terrifying intensity. "You can't keep us in this room forever," Nora said quietly, breaking the spell. Arthur didn't stop snapping tracks together. "You have everything you need here. They need fresh air. They need a life, Arthur, not a gilded cage." He finally stopped. He dropped a wooden train car onto the carpet and looked at her. The vulnerability of the morning was gone, replaced by the grim reality of his world. "If I let you out of this house," Arthur said, his voice flat and dead, "the people I work with will find out about them. And if they find out, they will use them to gut me. You stay in the cage, Nora, because outside the cage, the wolves are waiting." 4 weeks bled into the Persian rugs. Nora watched the sun drag shadows across the vaulted ceiling, marking the slow decay of their sanity. The suite smelled of stale, recirculated air and expensive lavender detergent. It was a beautiful, suffocating vacuum. Ben's cough had vanished, replaced by a pale, listless quiet. He stopped building train tracks. He spent hours staring out the reinforced glass windows at the sprawling, empty gardens below. Lily paced. She inherited Arthur's kinetic, restless energy, tearing the heads off imported porcelain dolls and kicking the solid wood baseboards until her toes bruised. Arthur visited every night at exactly 8 o'clock. He never wore his suit jacket. He always left his holstered gun on a hall table outside. He would sit on the floor, his long legs cramped up, and try to engage. He brought antique books, wooden puzzles, and quiet desperation. He was a man accustomed to commanding rooms with a single look, now entirely paralyzed by a 4-year-old's indifference. Nora watched from the armchair. The anger that had sustained her in the apartment was mutating into something far more dangerous: pity. She saw the dark, bruised exhaustion under Arthur's eyes. She saw the way his scarred hands trembled when he reached out to smooth Ben's hair, only to pull back before making contact. "He thinks you're going to hit him," Nora said one evening. The fireplace popped, sending a shower of orange sparks against the iron grate. Arthur flinched. He looked up from the puzzle he was forcing together. His dark eyes were shattered glass. "I would never." "He doesn't know that. All he knows is that you locked us in a box." Nora stood up, her bare feet silent on the rug. She crossed the room and sat on the floor opposite him. "You are starving them, Arthur, not of food, of life." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I am keeping them breathing. You are keeping them preserved," she snapped back, her voice low so she wouldn't wake the kids sleeping in the next room. "Like insects in amber. Yesterday, Lily asked me if the sun still worked. She hasn't felt wind on her face in a month." He dropped a wooden puzzle piece. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. "Leo is sniffing around. My own men are bribing the kitchen staff to find out who is living in this wing. If I let you walk out those front doors, you become a target, a weakness. I have spent my entire life excising weakness." "Then let us go," Nora whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Give us new names. Send us away. If you love them, you will let them vanish." Arthur surged forward. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical blow. He smelled of scotch, cedar, and raw, unrestrained panic. He boxed her in, his forearms resting on his knees, his face inches from hers. "I am a selfish, wretched man, Nora," Arthur rasped, his breath hot against her cheek. "I have killed men for looking at me wrong. I have burned down businesses for a slight. I am not the hero of this story. I will never let them go. I will never let you go." A heavy metallic thud echoed from the hallway, interrupting the tense silence. It wasn't the sound of Marco delivering tea. It was the heavy, blunt impact of a body hitting the wall. Arthur went completely rigid. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by the terrifying, cold apex predator. He stood up in a single, fluid motion, his hand instinctively dropping to his hip, where his gun usually rested. It was empty. He strode to the door. Nora scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the heavy brass fire poker from the hearth. Arthur threw the deadbolt back and yanked the door open. In the hallway, Dante had Leo pinned against the silk wallpaper, a massive forearm pressing into Leo's windpipe. Two of Leo's men lay groaning on the floor, their noses shattered. Leo was choking, his face turning a mottled purple, but his eyes were fixed on the open doorway. He saw the toys scattered on the floor. He saw Nora holding the fire poker. "Boss," Leo wheezed, blood spitting from his split lip. "I was just checking the perimeter." Arthur stepped out into the hall. He didn't shout. The silence he commanded was far worse. He reached out and placed his hand gently on Dante's shoulder. Dante instantly stepped back, releasing his grip. Oh, Leo slumped against the wall, gasping for air. He looked up, expecting Arthur to yell. Arthur simply grabbed Leo by the lapels of his charcoal suit. He didn't punch him. He pulled Leo close, so close their noses almost touched. "You have 10 minutes to pack your bags and leave this city," Arthur whispered, his voice a dead, emotionless void. "If the sun sets and you are still in my territory, I will cut you to pieces and mail you back to your mother in boxes. If you ever breathe a word of what you saw on this floor, I will dig up your father's grave and burn his bones." Leo nodded, a jerky, terrified movement. He scrambled backward, slipping on his own blood, and practically ran down the corridor, leaving his men to drag themselves away. Arthur stood in the hallway for a long time. The violence radiating from his rigid spine was palpable. He took a slow, deep breath, running a hand through his dark hair, desperately trying to lock the monster back in its cage. He turned around. Nora was standing in the doorway, her knuckles white around the iron poker. Behind her, Ben had woken up. The boy stood in his pajamas, clutching his blanket, staring at the blood on the hallway floor. Arthur closed his eyes. Defeat, heavy and absolute, crashed over his shoulders. He couldn't hide who he was from them forever. "I'll have Dante warm up the car," Arthur said, his voice cracking, devoid of all authority. He looked at Nora, his dark eyes pleading. "We're going to the park." Nora slowly lowered the poker. The gilded cage was broken. The wolves were out there, waiting. But as Arthur reached down, his scarred, violent hand trembling as he gently scooped his son into his arms, Nora realized something terrifying. The biggest, most dangerous wolf in the city was holding her child. And for the first time in 5 years, she actually felt safe. Will Arthur be able to protect Nora and the twins now that his dark world knows his greatest weakness? Can the ruthless Mafia boss balance the violence of his empire with the gentleness of fatherhood? Or will the looming threats tear their fragile new family apart? The stakes have never been higher, and the danger is just beginning. If you were captivated by this raw, emotional Mafia romance, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more intense storytelling. What will happen at the park? Comment below.